and welcome to today's remote session. This is Tom Bechtold from Secure World Digital. Hey, this is our Convergence series today. This is actually Season 5, Chapter 15, Supercharged Deception, How AI is Accelerating Social Engineering. Now, social engineering it's not new. This has been happening for a long, long time, way before computers, but it has rapidly risen to the forefront of cybercrime in recent years, particularly now that AI is amplifying its impact, right? So it's helping attackers manipulate trust with speed, scale, and sophistication. It's no longer that typed out poorly, it's misspelled, it's from some guy in Africa that we don't know, he's a prince of Nairobi or something, right? It's not like that anymore. We're getting actual stuff that looks like it came from a real human. It's very focused on humans. And we're going to get into some real world examples of how adversaries are adapting their playbooks. So, welcome everybody. I want to say thank you to the folks over at Abnormal for partnering with us on this Convergence series. It's been a wonderful ride so far, and as I said, we're on Season 5 already. So this has been very, very good, and I hope everybody out there is enjoying stuff. So just to recap real quick, we had Chapter 13 about a month ago. This was adversaries' new assistant weaponizing chatbots. Great conversation that day. Chapter 14 was about bridging the SOC talent gap with automation. So augmenting your staff and with automation and getting them to actually do more interesting work and not help desk tickets all the time. So check that one out if you haven't. I'll have resources, links in the resources for that. And today, of course, we're talking about the supercharged deception. So how they're really using psychology against us is kind of the gist of it. So real quickly, if you're new to the program, we've got our slides and a few other great materials that are loaded up in there for you to take a look at, some white papers and good research, educational stuff that you're going to want to take a look at. We're taking questions. We may not get to yours. I've got a ton of questions for the group, so we'll ship those off and we'll see if we can give you some answers. If you have any audio or video issues, F5 or function F5 should fix most of those. We are recording this, so please share this information, come back and revisit it. There is no silver bullet in cybersecurity, but collaboration is pretty darn close. So please share this information with folks that you know that might be struggling with this stuff. So real quick, our agenda today, we've got the rise of AI-powered deception. We're going to get into that, the psychology of trust and manipulation, breaking down human defenses, and a look ahead. So we're going to polish off our crystal ball and see what's happening in the future at the end of this thing. But let's get into some stuff. Who did we invite here today, right? Aside from you out in the audience, welcome, welcome. We've got Dr. Mary Aiken. She's a world-leading expert on cyber psychology. She's a speaker and author. We've also got EJ Whaley. He's the manager of product management over at Abnormal AI. So we've got the psychology person, and we've got somebody that deals with tech. So it's a great kind of a trade-off on who we have talking today. Dr. Mary Aiken, I will welcome you. Welcome to our program. If you wouldn't mind, kind of give us a little bit of a background, your backstory on how you got here today.
So I'm a cyber psychologist, and cyber psychology is the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. It's an advanced discipline within applied psychology. My specialist area is forensic cyber psychology, which looks at criminal, legal, and forensic aspects of abnormal and criminal behavior. And I'm kept pretty busy.
I would imagine you are very busy. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for taking some time to be here today. EJ Whaley, sir, same question for you. Can you give us a quick backstory on how you got here?
Yeah, sure thing. So as you mentioned, I lead one of the product management teams here. My team focuses on a variety of things, but one of those areas, we work directly with the detection engineering folks at Abnormal. They're responsible for, among other things, using AI to actually protect organizations from email-based threats and broader social engineering attacks beyond that. What that means is that day to day, we get to see firsthand how exactly threat actors are weaponizing AI, but then we also get to see too how our organization is able to take that same technology and help organizations to defend against it.
Appreciate the hard work you guys are doing over there. It's a daunting task, and we all got to work together. So I appreciate what you guys are doing. So thank you, thank you. Okay, let's get into some questions, guys. Let's see here. So the rise of AI-powered deception. As I talked about at the beginning, social engineering is not new. We've been experiencing this since the old days, right? It goes way back to somebody had something that somebody else wanted and they figured out a great way to lie about getting it, right? So that's kind of the gist of it all, but now it's way advanced. So I'm going to toss this first question out. Either of you guys can go for it. Social engineering has always been one of the most effective tools for attackers, like I just said. How is AI changing the scale and sophistication of these attackers? I guess let's start with Mary on this one, and then I definitely want to hear from you, EJ.
Okay, so you're right when you say that social engineering is behind the majority in terms of like the 90th percentile of cyber attacks. And the point is that social engineering has everything to do with psychology and very little to do with technology. And, people say, well, humans are the weakest link in the cybersecurity equation, but they're not the weakest link. They're just the most targeted link. And what we've seen is, you're right, there's nothing new in the universe. Fraud, manipulation have existed as long as humankind. But what is changing is that at a certain point, we were looking at human attacks on humans. So technology-mediated attack, where you have a human perpetrator and a human target. And then we've seen a shift now towards AI-fueled attacks on humans and the infrastructure that humans are protecting. And the next gen will be AI on AI, arguably. So the point is that the increasing sophistication is that those perpetrators, organized crime groups, that are deploying these attacks are increasingly using behavioral science, and specifically cyber behavioral science, as part of the attack profile in terms of socially engineered attacks, in terms of designing into human decision-making, cognitive biases, and those vulnerabilities. I'll give you one example, if we have a minute. You had a famous example recently of a Hong Kong employee about a year or so ago who paid out 25 million, and they were the target of an attack in a video call with a deepfake chief financial officer. But actually there were people on the call, one real person who was the employee who was being targeted, and the rest were deepfakes. So there was two psychological attack vectors there. First of all, there was tacking into what's called authority bias. So that's your propensity to do what your boss tells you to do. We're sort of hardwired to do that. And second was an interesting psychological attack vector, which was theory of conformity. And that is that if there's a consensus, people tend to, the majority of the time, agree with that consensus, even if the logic doesn't stand up. And there's a famous experiment about line lengths and people looking at graphics and the whole group saying, well, this line is shorter than this line, and then the target in the group ultimately agreeing. So that's an example of these complex attack vectors that are being deployed.
So the AI is actually just helping these folks that aren't necessarily psychologists themselves. It's just finding this information and helping them craft better emails is what it sounds like.
Oh, I'd say you have behavioral scientists on the dark side as well.
Oh, okay.
Or people with very good, knowledge of the behavioral sciences, help teaching the AI, helping it to craft and to learn, for sure.
I didn't want the bad guys to have you on their side too, or the equivalent of you. That's not good. I didn't want that answer. Okay. No, that's good though. We need to know about this stuff. EJ, what were you going to say? Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think that's where Dr. Aiken went, and also the point that you made a moment ago, Tom. It's the fact that we have these models that anyone has accessible to them at this point, right? And there's a component to this where you don't necessarily need the expertise of a Dr. Aiken anymore, but it certainly helps. At the same time, though, access to ChatGPT and other models like it's not going to replace that level of human knowledge and interaction and understanding, but it definitely helps, right? I think what we've seen over time AI in the past handful of years, we think it's just completely changed the economics of social engineering. It's lowered the bar to entry pretty significantly. And it's not just social engineering, it's all attack types. The example that Dr. Aiken gave, it's not necessarily related just to email, right? There are other aspects that can come into play with all of this. The reality of it is what used to take a significant amount of time and energy to go and research organizations and identify individuals at organizations, these models can output that in seconds, right? So that makes executing not just an attack, but executing a much more tailored and targeted attack that much easier. And then you add on top of it the fact that a lot of threat actors, they don't necessarily operate in the countries that they're targeting. In other words, the language that they're targeting folks in may not be their first language. They may not know that language at all. Social cues and contexts could be different, right? There could be different cultural norms. What used to be a scenario where you see an email that just looks a little bit off, the grammar's a little bit off, there's just something about it that doesn't feel right. A lot of that has gone away. And there's also the component to it too, where you are not just necessarily seeing more compelling content, but we're also seeing these scenarios where, again, threat actors can leverage this notion of, well, what do I say next? Or what's the appropriate response here? Whereas previously, there's probably a bit of guesswork that went into it, and that could trip the threat actors up. A lot of that has gone away.
And I think that we're not just seeing external attacks. What we're seeing is an evolution in terms of insider threats within organizations. And that's evolving in two ways. One, we're seeing active recruitment of insiders on dark websites, dark nets, effectively saying, do you work for this company? Would you like 50,000? And this is all done under the cover of anonymity. And secondly, we're seeing insider threat as a service manifesting on dark nets. So somebody who actually is working in an organization has, admin position or offering their credentials to actually facilitate an attack. And that's really syndication of insider threat. So it's no longer the anomaly within, an organization that you get sort of this lone wolf entity, but you're seeing what we describe as increasing syndication of that phenomena.
Yeah, and I think just to really quickly, just to touch upon something Dr. Aiken said a moment ago, the notion of services, right? So phishing as a service, for instance, it's been around for some time now, and it allows just about anybody to go on the dark web and go and target organizations via these phishing kits. But the difference now is that what that largely was the email templates. So let's make something that looks compelling. Let's make something that's relatively universal in nature. And then also the infrastructure, right? So when the emails go out, how exactly are those credentials being collected? How are they being accessed later on? Are you using different proxy technologies to be able to replay the credentials in the authentication session immediately? We're seeing a certain level of sophistication within those services now, which goes beyond just simply phishing and into these other areas. And again, it's a combination, I think, of what Dr. Aiken had mentioned earlier, where you have people who have a pretty deep knowledge who are going and building out these services, and they're profiting from that. But you also, again, have these systems in place which lowers the bar of entry for the quote unquote expertise that's required. Yes, you could certainly have a certain level of expertise that's above and beyond what an LLM is going to provide, but the LLM is also going to get most threat actors significantly further than they would have been able to previously. And so I think we're seeing a confluence of all of those things here.
Right. So we say that AI is changing how social engineering attacks are executed, but are we seeing a change in how the victims are experiencing it? Mary, what do you think about that?
I think what you're seeing is with AI-driven deception, LLMs and the recommender systems, that the messages can be tailored very specifically to the individual's psychology, to their behavior, to their emotional state. So the messages can be crafted that are very personalized. So the experience for the user actually, or the person on the receiving end, the target, is that this is most likely human. So in other words, it's so good that it sort of transcends the concept that this might be a, you know, a cyber attack from a threat actor. In other words, it's almost human, like back to the deep fake scenario I talked about. So, and it's going to feel highly personalized. And therefore, for the target trying to differentiate, is this really somebody communicating with me from a vendor or, wanting an invoice paid? Or is this, a machine-driven attack? Differentiating between those two is going to be extremely complex going forward.
It feels like with that, the way it's being tailored and customized to each person, it is, and this kind of segues into our next section, actually. But it's building trust with these people that the other forms didn't really do, because you were just more dubious. You're like, I don't know, Bob Nelson that just emailed me, and it's spelled wrong. There's a bunch of spelling wrong, or you look at the links and stuff, and because we've been trained, to start looking at these things and dissect these emails, but now it looks like it's coming from me, and I've emailed you, and you're like, oh, I know Tom. So now it's building trust. So you've studied how people form trust online. How is AI changing that psychology of trust, and what makes it different from other digital stuff that is deception-based?
Well, trust to date has been sort of a currency in the digital ecosystem, which is now under severe attack, effectively, because of the sophistication of the attack vectors. And if we take that into human psychology, I mean, we as a species are working with a very old piece of technology that's been about 1 million years in development, and that's the human brain. And our senses are hardwired to serve us in real world contexts. So when we meet somebody and we're trying to establish whether we can trust them or not, we're using our senses. We're looking visually, we're listening to them, shaking hands, haptic, touch in terms of feedback, even smell. And effectively, those senses fail us online, because online is a lean medium, but it's also a medium where deception can be practiced freely. And what does that mean? It means that we're moving towards an era where you cannot have trust online. It's a label that's been applied online, and it's a label that's been transposed into cybersecurity. But I would argue that it doesn't have a place, given the current sort of, threats that are manifesting. And I think that the only way we can establish trust online is what I describe as the trust paradox. And what that is that we're moving towards an era of zero trust, always verify. And paradoxically, zero trust is the only thing that's going to build trust.
Interesting. I like that concept. We know zero trust is security folks, so that actually kind of plays into that. Makes sense. EJ, from what you're seeing with customers and real world threats, how does this psychological dimension play out in those actual attacks that you guys are seeing?
Yeah, so to comment briefly on something Dr. Aiken mentioned a moment ago, the notion of just the human interaction, the human element, the in-person nature of how our brains tend to work, and that going away online. What's amplified by the way that threat actors are able to utilize systems and develop these threats is the fact that when you don't have the more evolutionarily wired responses to things when you're online and you're behind a screen, you can almost turn trust into a data problem in the same way that we do a lot of other things. So in other words, we can use AI to study what happens in corporate environments, but we can do that from the perspective of communications, right? What words and phrases are used in certain scenarios to engender trust? What words and phrases are used to build camaraderie, build morale? All of that can be played back into these communications that are occurring online when these threat actors are reaching out, when these threat actors are engaging with organizations. And the ability to replicate that now is significantly easier because, again, there's so much access to so much data that says this is how to build that trust, this is how to build that morale. And then there's another component to this too, where I don't necessarily think, and Dr. Aiken can probably comment on this too, I don't necessarily think that most people log on each day and say to themselves, I think I'm going to get an email to my inbox that's targeting me, right? That's not necessarily the way that we go about our lives. We get up in the morning, we do a job, we utilize different communication channels, whether that be chat or phone or Zoom or email. We use them in very specific ways, and we get into our routines. And I don't think that we're necessarily hardwired to tell ourselves, well, I could be on the receiving end of an illegitimate communication today, and I should be on the lookout for that. So in other words, there's a pretty concerted effort to make all communications look a certain way. I mean, most of us utilize tools, right? There's AI built into just about every single email system nowadays. You can install add-ons that make your emails look more legitimate or make your chat messages look more legitimate, more professional sounding, whatever the case may be. Threat actors are able to utilize the exact same things. And so it makes it hard to understand when and where the legitimate communications or illegitimate communications are coming from, because everything just looks so similar and it's intentional, right? And then there's also an aspect of this too, where you can utilize these AI systems to analyze not just the communication globally. So in other words, not just looking at how to build trust, how to build morale, et cetera, but also being able to look at, well, organization A, what is the company hierarchy? How do they tend to communicate internally? And that's done via, unfortunately, a lot of these data breaches where troves and troves and troves of email data come out. And so it's not just, in a roundabout way, it's not just, hey, I'm going to throw the dart at the wall and hope that I land on the right language. It's being able to lean on the data I alluded to earlier, but then also potentially being able to look at, well, how do these particular executives communicate? And again, in years past, you would say, well, that's not accessible data to the outside world. Again, unfortunately, in the world that we live in, a lot of it is accessible. And so there's this ability to craft much more legitimate emails. And that also is preying on just what I think is, in a lot of ways, you have a system that you shouldn't necessarily trust, but I think as humans, we tend to be relatively open and trusting. And so that becomes a pretty problematic scenario to have to address time and again.
Yeah, and the scenario, if you want to conceptualize it and paint a picture of what you're talking about, think of it as something with the power of GPT, like a fire hose being pointed at you as an individual in an organization. And you, as a human, are trying to withstand that. It's a very, very powerful entity. And I think that's where increasingly we'll need agentic AI co-workers, if you will, working alongside humans within an organization to be able to mount a defense.
Yeah, otherwise you're just
I would agree.
like Jeopardy against the IBM Watson thing, right? It's going to beat you every time. Now, granted, when they did that on TV, I understand that there was like, they let it like load information or whatever, but I get the point though. We have an uphill battle against this. So, excellent. I'm going to move on to our next category, if you guys don't mind. Why are humans still vulnerable, right? We know that stuff's happening, right? But why do you think humans remain so vulnerable to manipulation, even as awareness of cyber threats continues to grow? I mean, there's a whole industry of just educating people on awareness training, right? So, Dr. Mary, how does this keep happening?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things there. First of all, it becomes what we call in psychology the wallpaper effect. If you just keep saying to people, don't click and don't open attachments, ultimately, it's like the wallpaper in your room. You don't even see it anymore. And people sort of zone out and they just, the same messaging is coming out all the time. And when people hear of cyber attacks or breaches, it can go both ways. First of all, you can have the fact that people become desensitized, that there's just so much of it happening that people think they don't even pay attention to it anymore. And that's not really good from an organizational point of view. Or the other end of the spectrum is that there's so much of it that people become, that they feel it's hopeless. In other words, that they won't be able to defend themselves. What in psychology is called learned helplessness. I think that anybody who's ever manned an IT desk where people are sending in, requests to, I can't remember my password, I'm locked out of the system, whatever, they'll have a good idea of what learned helplessness is that people become over-reliant on the technology and basically give up. So how do you counter that? I'm not a big fan of the sort of technologies that start to actually, spam and socially engineer their own employees to try and catch them out and think that that's educational. In fact, it can drive behavior underground. People object to being dehumanized and being treated like lab rats. So I think we have to think about more sophisticated responses that can empower humans in cyber contexts, that can upgrade their skill sets, that can help the organization at a level whereby you're not deploying surveillance to the point that people get completely demotivated. So there's a fine balance there in terms of how you increase the resilience of the organization, but also increase the psychological resilience of the employees and the users.
You brought up increased reliance on these AIs. We use them all the time. I use them for slides. I use them for just making memes and other fun stuff, right? But people have these things for virtual assistants. They're using chatbots, productivity tools. How is this increased reliance on this hindering our ability to recognize when AI is being used against us, though?
I think what you have to do is, I often advise that you have to think like a profiler. So I'm a behavioral profiler. And if a mundane message is incoming, in other words, if there's no call to action, then it is what it is. It's just a message. The point at which you have a call to action embedded into the messaging and using particular behavioral drivers like urgent, maybe the use of caps, the leveraging of an authority position of I'm the CEO, I'm the CFO, and the just-in-time premise as well. This has to be done or we will miss the opportunity. Once you begin to see those behavioral drivers embedded in the messaging, then effectively that should serve as a red flag. So if you feel you're being forced, urgency, coerced, authority, any of those psychological drivers are strongly embedded in the messaging, then you should be on alert. Now, it could be that it is your boss who's sending you an email to say, do this urgently. And that comes into an organizational culture that those who are at the C level in the organization should never punish employees for resisting those commands or orders with that level of urgency attached to them.
Right, because you don't want to get fired. I mean, you want to listen to what your boss has to say. So that makes sense. And you shouldn't be penalized for doing your job. Somebody else probably should have educated you on a different process, perhaps. That way, this didn't happen, right? With the 25 million that got transferred. That example. EJ, let me ask you. What are you guys doing over there that will actually kind of look at this? Because like I said in the last question, we're overly reliant on this stuff, some folks. What are you guys doing over there at Abnormal that's going to be fight AI with AI to kind of thwart that? What do you have on that?
Yeah, so I think there are probably two primary components, and we can get into a whole host of others, but to keep it more brief, something that Dr. Aiken mentioned earlier, the notion of, she said, I think spamming employees internally. So the notion of phishing simulation training, so we are of the same mind. We have a particular module in that arena. The primary difference, though, is that we don't necessarily view it as an opportunity for taking punitive action. So there's some organizations where the sole focus of those phishing simulation campaigns is to basically measure employee performance and then in turn enroll folks in security awareness training. But there's a place for training, there's a place for reinforcement, but there's also a component to this where, and Dr. Aiken had touched upon this quite a bit, awareness isn't going to change the emotion, right? The attackers are not necessarily like, yes, the emails that they're sending or the communications that are coming across, they're really compelling, but they're really not hacking systems, so to speak. They're really looking at, well, how exactly do I prey on human instinct? As an example, I mean, and this was a firsthand example. I knew that we were going to be sending out, we were in the process of developing this module, and I knew that we were going to be sending out phishing simulation emails to a select group of folks just to see basically how the product was coming along. So I knew the email was coming. I got the email. I looked at the email, and the email referenced receiving some kind of a gift from the company. And that might sound like a giveaway. Well, why would they do that? Well, here's the thing. We've actually done this in the past, right? If certain quarterly performance is really good, there might be a company-wide send out, like, branded socks, branded shirts, branded hats, water bottles, whatever the case may be, right? And sometimes when those go out, you're asked to, for instance, go and verify your address. And so getting an email like that, despite the fact that I knew that they were coming, I still looked at it and I still had to really think, okay, like there are these giveaways here, not to mention the fact that I know that this is supposed to be happening, but there was enough within that from the psychology of, well, we do this from time to time. Maybe I missed another email at some point that was announcing this. Maybe it was announced at a company-wide meeting. And so for us, when we think about the awareness component, it's really trying to tailor it at the employee level in the sense that we want to make sure that employees understand, going back to the point I made earlier, like you could be targeted and here's why you specifically might be targeted within your role. And here are the types of things that you might see in your role from a threat actor, and here's why. And so it's not trying to enroll folks in training and make them take quizzes and do all sorts of other things just for the sake of like, hey, you click that link in that email. And it's a lot more from our perspective about being able to try to better educate the employee around just trying to be more aware, so that in that moment where there is that emotional reaction of like, wait, hold on, should I be getting this? There's a little bit more data to draw from. And then the second aspect of this is just the detection component of things, right? At the end of the day, the same technologies that are being utilized by threat actors to put these emails together, we have the ability to utilize that exact same technology in reverse to identify patterns that deviate away from typical. So in other words, you might have emails that look and sound much more authentic and genuine. We can utilize similar technologies to actually identify scenarios where they're not authentic, they're not legitimate, they're not genuine. And so they might look and sound and feel that way to a human, but we can utilize the same types of approaches from a detection perspective to say, are they really, right? Do they actually look the way that they normally do? And if so, why? If not, why not? And that's really what underpins the approach that we take from a detection perspective overall within our different products.
And I think in terms of sort of phishing simulation, it's not whether definitively it's right or wrong. It's how do you do it? How do you deploy it and what are the consequences? If in some cases where people do something wrong and then, 3 strikes and you're out effectively, that just creates anxiety in the workforce. If it's deployed in a way that's educational, empowering, building knowledge and skill sets, then it's going to be seen as a positive entity within an organization.
Yeah, and it's not at all to downplay the criticality of a practice like that. It's not at all to downplay the potential severity of somebody interacting with something that they shouldn't. But it is interesting being on our side of things, talking to different organizations and seeing the different ways in which these programs are applied. So Dr. Aiken, you alluded a moment ago to the three strikes policy. I've had conversations where organizations do that, and I'm not here to judge whether that's correct or incorrect or properly applied or improperly applied, but it is happening. And ultimately, when we get into this notion of the psychology of this all, I think in a roundabout way, that type of policy, it actually amplifies the entire psychological component even further. In other words, it's not just about the threat actors anymore. It's now also about, well, what's the internal policy driving this? And I don't necessarily think that the internal policy drives better behavior. It probably just drives more paranoid behavior. And one might say, well, isn't more paranoid behavior better? Not necessarily, because the more paranoid behavior potentially creates a whole host of other problems. You mentioned earlier people reaching out to the help desk for what might be trivial problems. The thing that we see the most is just a massive influx of emails being reported as potential phishing emails because people don't necessarily trust themselves. Well, okay, like I just pressed this button. Yes, a lot of organizations would say, well, they're doing exactly what we want them to do. But what is happening in a lot of cases is you're creating a massive amount of noise. And so you're telling yourselves, well, we're more secure because we're not reliant upon the employee base. The employee base trusts us, the security team, to go through and sift through this information and find the emails that are problematic, and we'll deal with that. But then you have to ask yourself, what other areas are you not getting to when you've effectively, I don't want to say you've created a problem, but at the very least, you've created a pretty significant amount of overhead. And so there's more of an interplay here that I think some organizations tend to want to acknowledge. And everyone has a different take on this. Everybody has a different perspective. And it's not to suggest that I am the one who should come in and be the arbiter of what every organization should be doing, right? There are different applications of different tools for different reasons. But ultimately, it's interesting going through some of these conversations and seeing what some organizations are doing. And I think in some cases, them not realizing other problems that they're creating in the process by applying certain policies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the premise of unintended consequences in a behavioral context. You know, everybody's fighting the same fight. Everybody's trying to get to the same point. But sometimes when you're pushing behavioral buttons, there are consequences maybe that you don't expect, and they can be counterproductive.
Yeah.
Right. I want to touch base on social media. We haven't really talked about that too much, but I feel like as partly why humans are vulnerable, we have this weird duality where like some folks at work, they're very prim and proper, they're very quiet about stuff, but then they go home and they get on social media and then it's just like, boom, they're sharing everything under the sun. Talk to me about the psychology of that. How do we go from like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, how I'm supposed to work, and then all of a sudden I'm at home and I'm like, I feel like I can just go ahead and share every bit of news I've ever had on Facebook or Instagram. Why do we do that? How do we stop doing that?
Well, in cyber psychology, you know, we talk about the impact of technology on human behavior. So what we're doing now, this isn't transactional. The three of us are actually meeting in a very powerful psychological space, and that's cyberspace. And the thing is that when people go online, their behavior changes in certain ways. So first of all, you've got what's called ODE, the online disinhibition effect. And it dictates that people will do things in cyber context that they won't do in the real world. And there's a lot of examples of that. You've also got the power of anonymity or perceived anonymity online in terms of what people will do. And then you've got generational aspects. You know, we talk about digital exhaust, that trace material that's lying around in cyberspace. And the more of that you generate, the easier it is for an entity to socially engineer an attack against you because you're providing a lot of data. And that opens up the attack points to you or to your organization. But the generational construct piece is if you take people in their 40s and 50s and you talk to them about privacy, they'll have a really good understanding of what privacy is as a construct. if you talk to a 19-year-old about privacy and what they do with their data, their information, their images, they'll share, yeah, but I only shared it with, they'll say, I only shared it with 100 people in my close friends group. That's their construct of privacy.
It's a matter of perception at that point. I mean, we have different values, I guess, in what we think is okay. Interesting.
I would even comment here really briefly on this as far as the social media component. I know we like to tell ourselves that LinkedIn, for instance, is not a social media network, but it very much is. All right. And this has become less prevalent over the years, but starting maybe in the mid 2010s, you would have a lot of people who would go online and they would post the different technologies that they utilize day to day within their jobs. And so for some folks, maybe that's not necessarily that big of a deal if you're stating that you're utilizing some system that an outside party could pretty reliably assume that you're using in whatever role you might hold. For instance, if I tell someone that I'm proficient in using PowerPoint, that's probably not going to be the end of the world. But when you go and you look at, for instance, folks that work in IT or cybersecurity in particular, and they're going on LinkedIn and they're saying, I do, here's my job title and I've worked here for this amount of time. And here are the systems that I work on and here are the projects that I've led. That's a lot of information that is now accessible to the outside world. And again, it's become less prevalent because a lot of organizations have cracked down on this pretty significantly. And so the question becomes, well, why would anyone do that in the first place? Well, LinkedIn is obviously a network within which we can collaborate, communicate, and network with others in the field. So maybe there's some component to it where a different person at a different company sees that and you connect and you have some conversation about one of the technologies. Or what is probably more common is if you're looking for a job and you want to get a job at a different company and you want to ensure that outsiders know what exactly it is you've been working on, what are you proficient in? So you're not thinking about, well, what are the ramifications beyond the immediate, right? What are the ramifications beyond my wants and needs? Well, I want to share this information to show it off. I want to share this information to connect with people. I want to share this information to let potential third-party recruiters know that this is what I'm working on, right? I'm not just a cybersecurity engineer. I'm a cybersecurity engineer that's worked on these specific tools. And so if you use these tools, I might be a good fit at your company too. That's the immediate want and need. It's not necessarily anyone thinking, well, how could this be weaponized against me? How could this be utilized against me? And so I think that's where it really comes into play is day to day. Again, we get in, we do our jobs. It can be a routine. When you take a step out of that, you're usually not thinking about the broader ramifications. I think you're thinking about, well, what are my immediate desires here and how do I satisfy them? And that can be oversharing, even if as an individual, you don't feel like it's oversharing.
And that's a really good point in terms of, particular technologies that people are, I could say bragging, but that's what they're showing what they can do. What I'm always shocked by on platforms like LinkedIn, which are just a professional platform, is the information that people leak or hemorrhage in some cases about their familial connections. So you'll see senior executives saying, I want to congratulate my son who's just graduated, or my daughter has done this, or my sister. And they actually create this map of their family connections. Now, if you're somebody who's at C-level in an organization and you may be technologically literate, then that's not necessarily you're not necessarily the point of attack. If somebody wants to compromise you, they might go to your niece who's just graduated in something, or your daughter, compromise them and use that as the attack vector. And you've just made a map for them of how to do that. Yeah.
And I think when we think about the shifts that we've seen in tactics, and we've mentioned this a couple of times now, but it's actually leveraging AI to effectively orchestrate everything. And so There's a whole plethora of information on executives, especially the more public executives. So folks who are out there a bit more, who attend more conferences, give more talks. But even those who don't, even those who feel like they are private, it can be something as simple as a mention like that on a platform like LinkedIn or anywhere else for that matter. There's just because people are being attacked in their professional lives does not mean that Facebook, Instagram, and other social media platforms are not being used as aggregates to identify this information. But ultimately, what we're seeing in a lot of these instances is threat actors, they're using these systems to perform reconnaissance, to perform the content creation. And ultimately, the more information that's put out there, even as trivial as it might seem, and well, they graduated back in May, and it was May 2 years ago. Like what's the big deal? I posted it one time and it was 3 sentences long. Well, no, in some cases that can be enough to actually go through and to your point, Dr. Aiken, to use that as the potential vector in. And then from there, there's also the ability to think about, and again, not necessarily on an individual threat actor level, but you can lean on AI to do some of this. Well, if that's the entry point, how do we pivot around? Where are we going from here? And that's where, again, the amount of reconnaissance that can be done by these systems can be so impactful at the end of the day, because it's these seemingly small, trivial, unimportant mentions, they can actually become incredibly important to the overall strategy that threat actors employ.
And a good way to actually maybe utilize that in terms of active cyber defense would be potentially to build tools that can data mine and create those profiles and extract those nuggets and do it for executives in a company. I mean, some of those tools exist, but not at a highly sophisticated level, where you could say, I'm going to show your vulnerability and I'm going to data mine your posts for the last, whatever, 7-8 years on LinkedIn, and I'm going to show you what can be extrapolated from that, and where the potential attacks may come from because of that information.
Yeah, and then to take it even one step further, I think the question also becomes to, can you take the awareness? Can you take what any third party is able to identify, whether we're talking threat actors, third-party organizations that are looking to help and aid, even first-party, right? Are there things that organizations can do internally on their own to try to identify this information? The awareness is one thing. I think it's then being able to plug that back into the ability to identify or detect, right? In other words, it's like I was mentioning earlier, you can tell someone that it can happen. You can tell someone that it's probably coming. But even in the moment, do they have the awareness to spot it? And I think there's an opportunity there for there to be interplay between what are we telling the individual and what are we expecting of the individual, but also how can the system potentially aid alongside of that? And it goes back to what you were mentioning earlier, Dr. Aiken, as far as agentic AI potentially being able to augment some of what humans are doing on a day-to-day basis in order for us to be able to leverage these systems in a more impactful way, and not make it strictly about, well, we have to rely on the system to identify, and if the system doesn't identify, well, then we're out of luck. There needs to be interplay between the human element and the systems element here.
Makes me think of Space Odyssey. I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that for you. We need the thing to tell us that, right? Because I'm going to post something on social media and it reads it and be like, are you sure you really want to ask that question of folks? I mean, I think that's almost what we need, although that's a scary concept because that thing ultimately got rid of Dave. We don't want that to happen. But let's move on. We're going to shift gears. Let's look ahead. So things are shifting. What shifts do you see in attacker tactics as they incorporate AI into their playbooks? And how do you foresee, the sophistication of these attacks evolving even further? I was going to ask like 2 or 3 years, but this stuff's moving faster than any other technology. So I would even say like 6 to 9 months. What are your predictions around this stuff, Dr. Aiken?
Well, my predictions are that it's going to get more sophisticated. It's going to scale up. the cost barrier is low to leveraging, to deploying mass targeted attacks. And I think that we can look at how we can augment defenses. It's not about artificial intelligence. I prefer to think about it as IA. So if we look at deploying artificial intelligence in terms of defense, people can think, well, are we replacing humans? Are we taking humans out of the loop? But I'm a behavioral scientist. We barely understand how the human brain works. To think that we can build something to replace something we don't understand is a flawed premise. I prefer to think of it not as AI or deploying AI in terms of countermeasures. I prefer to think of it as IA, intelligence augmentation. So using AI in tandem with humans to defend ourselves. In the greater landscape, I think part of the problem is that when you look at the premise of cyber attacks, effectively what we have is passive cyber defense. So what does that mean? If you are an organization and you're under attack, you cannot strike back because that in itself is a cybercrime. And therefore, all you can do is sort of, raise the drawbridge and defend the perimeter of the network, but you can't do anything. And that's not good in the general scheme of things, because the criminal justice system has relied on the premise of deterrence and consequence for behaviors, except in cyberspace. And therefore, these attacks will continue to rise in severity. IARPA did some work recently on the idea of active cyber defense. So the project was Rescind, Reimagining Security with Cyber Psychology Informed Network Defense. And the project examined the premise of psychologically hacking back. So looking at cognitive vulnerabilities in cyber attackers, because ultimately there's always going to be a human somewhere in the loop on the cyber attack side, as well as cyber defense. And the project looked at this empowering idea of psychologically hacking back. Myself and a couple of scientists, behavioral scientists, cognitive scientists, and a specialist in LLMs, we wrote a paper about how industry might engage in active cyber defense in terms of psychologically hacking back. And the paper is titled "The Enterprise Strikes Back."
I love it. I love it. You got the little nod to Star Wars in there. Good stuff. Good stuff. EJ, what are you thinking about? As I mentioned, looking ahead, 6 to 9 months, maybe a year out. What predictions do you have for us?
Yeah, so I think something that Dr. Aiken mentioned a moment ago is largely where my mind goes with a lot of this, in terms of the way that we can try to strike the balance, if you will, from the perspective of being able to work against. There's one point before that, though, that I think is worth making, and it's the fact that the sophisticated attacks, or what an outsider might consider to be or deem to be a sophisticated attack previously, I think those were, I'll say, rarer. Not necessarily altogether rare, but they were rarer in the sense that I think in a lot of cases, what a lot of organizations sit back and think is, well, these more sophisticated attacks, they don't happen at scale, right? We have to deal with a lot of, for lack of a better term, a lot of the junk, right? There's going to be a lot of volumetric attacks that are targeting us. They're lower level. They're easier to spot. They're easier to spot from our systems perspective. They're easier to spot from an employee-based perspective. They're easier to spot from a security team perspective. But the reality is that junk has gotten better and harder to spot. So there's a problem there, but there's also an aspect to this too, where the rarer, sophisticated attacks, they're becoming more of the norm. And so in other words, I think sometimes people think, when they hear about, especially the attacks that hit the news, I think they oftentimes think to themselves, this must have been very coordinated. This must have been very planned. This must have taken weeks or months. In some cases, Not necessarily, right? In some cases, some of the things that we hear about in the news, it's just the level of persistence that threat actors have. And what I mean by that is, it's not just we sent one email and that one email was engaged with, and then the entire ball of yarn unspooled. Well, no, actually, they were sending attack after attack after attack, just waiting for the one. And all these attacks are relatively sophisticated, waiting for the one to be engaged with. And then that's where I think the level of sophistication really comes into play, where the things that threat actors can lean on to further the attack, to advance the attack, to pivot and move around, that's the big shift here. So in other words, the volume game, so to speak, I don't think is going anywhere. It's just that the volume of attacks will also be coupled with a level of sophistication we haven't seen before. And instead of it being, well, hey, we have this one very coordinated instance where it led to something pretty outsized, I don't necessarily think that's the case, right? I think it's going to be that we're going to see a relatively high volume of sophisticated attacks that we have to be able to identify to prevent that level of sophistication from being from allowing or letting out threat actors get even further with toward their ends in terms of what they're looking to do. But again, from there, I think it becomes just a matter of, well, how do you do that, right? That's the big question. And that's where I think we need to look really deeply into how exactly can we incorporate systems, can we incorporate AI into the mix to be able to identify the more sophisticated emails, outreach via chat, et cetera. And by trying to take an old world approach, it's not going to allow us to do that, right? We have to be forward thinking in this.
And the point is that businesses conduct their work online. This is the medium. This is what keeps, businesses moving. And effectively, if that medium becomes so fraught and so complex and so under attack, then you're going to get like paralysis by analysis within an organization. How does the sales force operate? How does the marketing department operate? How does, logistics operate? If everything becomes so fraught and so under attack that the system can't function. And I think that's something we've got to really think about down the line, that effectively these levels of attacks could paralyze an organization and stop it from trading or from doing business.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality is we're there on a certain level, and what I mean by that is we've seen ransomware attacks, for instance, become highly problematic for organizations where systems are down, they can't make payroll, they can't access logistics systems, they can't ship product out, they can't do much of anything, and then there's a combination at that point of spending the time to try to get back online. Do you pay the ransom? What do you do? And not to downplay ransomware, but that's just ransomware. That's just one vector, right? There are a whole host of other opportunities and potentialities with this in terms of how threat actors can cripple companies. And then there's also an aspect of this too, and we haven't talked much about this here, but there's the financial gain component. Ransomware is not actually the most lucrative attack type or threat type. There's a lot more leverage with a ransomware attack in the sense that if you are able to shut down systems, you can easily cost these companies millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. So at a certain point, I think these ransomware groups, they're very intelligent in the sense that they can say, well, you pay us a small sum in comparison to the amount that you're going to lose. Why wouldn't you pay it? And then on top of that, we also have cyber insurance in place now where cyber insurers cover costs in some cases. So it's an interesting business model, if you will, from a threat actor's perspective. But the more direct way to these payouts is actually through social engineering. It's through vendor fraud. Threat actors can gain access to thousands of dollars in gift cards. And these are still things that happen. You can go to the store today and you'll see signs at the registers trying to alert people to gift card scams. It's a very simple way for small-time scammers to make enough money to get by on. But then when you think about it at the corporate scale, being able to redirect a payment for several $1 million, that's a huge payout. And you can, in a lot of cases, execute that by sending 3 or 4 emails back and forth. So the level of effort that goes into that can be relatively low. Whereas when we think about ransomware can be pretty extensive to execute as far as all of the ins and outs that require the infrastructure. It's not that simple to do. That all being said, again, I think we're at that place now where organizations are being crippled by this. But I think, and I don't want this to be the doom and gloom pessimistic perspective on this. It can get a lot worse. I think we've been fortunate in a sense. I think the defenders, so to speak, have done a relatively good job up to now, all things considered. But I think over time, there's a definite possibility that the problem gets worse, particularly if we don't pay close attention to it.
Yeah, no, I agree. We need to get more awareness out there on this stuff. For sure. And I love both of you said it basically in two different ways, but we've got to find the right balance between working with our AI partners and our human folks and the processes. We've got to fine tune this stuff. As Mary said, we've got a tool that we've been trying to understand for like 1,000,000 years, and we still don't understand it, but yet we're still trying to make things work within here and outside of it. So we've got to work a little bit smarter, I think. Thank you, both EJ and Dr. Mary Aiken, for being here today. This concludes our time together, but I want to just mention real quickly to everybody out there, we've got now all 3 parts of season 5 are available for you on demand. So if you missed any of this stuff, or if you had to skip out early on one of them, this is all available now. So there's a great, we've got links in there for you in the resource tab for all of this stuff. There's also, speaking of, there's a really cool offer, I want to say, from the folks over at Abnormal AI. It's a free email risk assessment. It takes about 10 minutes or so to install this thing, but it goes in and takes a look at what's going on within your confines of your network, and it kicks out a really cool report that you're going to want to take a look at. This is no obligation. Check it out. It's free. They're not going to beat down your door going, you got to buy some stuff now. Check it out. It's free. It's in the resource tab. See if it's something of use for you. If it is, reach out to them. They're happy to hear from you. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But there is some great stuff in the resources, other stuff from Secure World that's happening with the digital piece, the virtual conferences and whatnot. If you haven't already, download your certificate of attendance as well. If you have any trouble getting that, I know it's a pop-up. Some folks obviously sell that stuff blocked. But email me, tomb@secureworld.io. We'll get you that taken care of. Otherwise, thank you, everybody. We're looking forward to seeing everybody in season 6 in 2026. So I'll see everybody else at our normally scheduled remote sessions. But be well, everybody. Thanks again, EJ. Thanks again, Dr. Mary Aiken, for being here.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.